on my end. I don't know if you all can see, but it's lovely to see everyone coming in. Um, I'll slowly get us started because we do only have an hour and we have lots of great topics to discuss. Unfortunately, one of our panelists had to cancel. Sarah Lagerson is not going to join us today due to weather-related issues and school closures and the like. But nevertheless, we're excited to be here with two panelists, lots of topics, and we do want to give some time for question and answer from the attendees in the audience. So I'll get us started. So welcome everyone to this webinar on teaching sociological methods as and for public engagement, hosted by First Publics. For those that are new to this space, First Publics provides a space to explore the politics, pedagogy, and practice of teaching as public sociology. We publish first-person reflections on the embodied and experiential aspects of teaching as public sociology and curate dialogues on timely topics and long-standing concerns related to teaching as public sociology. This year, with the generous support of the American Sociological Association's Carla B. Howry Teaching Enhancement Fund, we've been producing content, including webinars like this, on the topic of methods and methods as public sociology. Our first webinar, which took place in November, was on teaching methods in times of crisis. I encourage you to check that out on our site and look out for our third webinar in this series, which will be held in the spring. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists, two interdisciplinary and publicly engaged scholars who will help us think about methods for and as public engagement. The topic is near and dear for me, and I'm honored to participate in this conversation. First, we have Dr. Piper Sledge. She's an associate professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. Dr. Sledge has published research on the meaning of gender across a range of contexts. Her 2021 book, Bodies Unbound, was awarded the Best Publication Award for the Body and Embodiment section of the ASA. Her current research focuses on the experiences of mixed-race queer individuals and is at the confluence of queer theory, Black feminist theory, critical mixed race studies, and Indigenous studies. In addition, she's director of community-based initiatives and research for the Indigenous Partnership Program of Cosmic Explorer, where she supports respectful collaboration with Indigenous communities. Dr. Arturo Baiocchi is a professor in the Division of Social Work at California State University, Sacramento. His research focuses on homelessness, the experiences of vulnerable young adults, and mental health in Sacramento. His scholarly efforts have been dedicated to addressing the challenges of people who are chronically homeless. And to that end, Dr. Baiocchi has extensive experience conducting research with social service organizations and affected communities, including establishing long-term partnerships with the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council and Sacramento Step Forward, among other community organizations and programs. In addition to research publications, Dr. Baiocchi has published work using various media, including documentary film and podcasting. As I said earlier, as folks were logging on, Dr. Sarah Lagerson, who was scheduled to be here today, was unable to join us and sends her regrets. We hope to engage her in a future conversation related to these topics. So welcome, Piper and Arturo. We're excited to talk with both of you today. One of the most impressive dimensions of both of your professional profiles, and one of the many reasons we've invited you here today, is this unique capacity that you both have demonstrated in conducting rigorous and innovative research in dialogue and in partnership with concerned communities and kind of deeply affected publics. I'd like to start by asking you about the role that sociological methods, kind of thinking about methods, plays in your community engaged and public facing scholarship. So perhaps we can start with Arturo. You have an impressive kind of range of what some folks call kind of applied projects, all of which demonstrate a care and concern for maintaining integrity of and the rigor surrounding research methods. So I hope you could get us started by helping us think what role sociological research methods play in this community engaged work, and what is particularly important or challenging when doing research with and for communities. How do you keep sociological research methods front and center, despite what I can imagine are different pressures, different urgencies, different cultures of work and evidentiary cultures, etc.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation for this discussion and the thoughtful question. Yeah, I think about this issue quite often because, in my impression, not a lot of people outside the academy understand what sociologists do. And particularly myself, I'm embedded within the School of Social Work here in Sacramento. And so I feel like I leverage the identity of the egghead academic slash social scientist more than a sociologist, though I'm trained as a sociologist and emphasize sociological methods. I feel like, particularly when I'm dealing with public stakeholders such as local politicians or state level politicians, that leveraging my training as a rigorous academic but social scientist, and I kind of bring the sociology implicitly and the way that I frame my projects. A lot of my projects have had some kind of advisory community role where we ask people, particularly I work in the space of homelessness and housing insecurity, as you mentioned. And as you can imagine, this is a pretty contested space politically and also from a policy level. And there's a lot of stigma and I would say misinformation about why people are experiencing homelessness. We're going through the last 10 years a pretty unprecedented increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness. And I feel like the research on it is kind of a battle sport in some ways because we're reporting on things that not necessarily the state is particularly eager to report on, and how we do that reporting. And one way that I have found to kind of engage the community is by establishing these advisory boards with people with lived experience, both people who are experiencing homelessness currently or have recovered from homelessness or are working in the space of social services. And I use that committee. I formulate these committees regularly and then bring specific questions for them to consider in terms of the framing of the research as well as the overall questions that we're pursuing. And that's been very useful, although it's challenging because folks with lived experience might not have a lot of background in research methodology, and so there is a little bit of where the technical meets the public, and it's an exciting space because I do think you can kind of push the needle a bit. It's just one example. One of the things that we used to discuss a lot about is how you measure race and gender and the complexities of those questions, and also why we measure those things and how can we talk about racial and ethnic disparities when we are also trying to capture the complexity of identities. I can go on for a long time here, but beyond saying that it's what makes the work engaging and also exciting, but also a little bit stressful, because you have so many stakeholders who are have competing interests in how you frame the research. This is where I think it's nice to be a tenured faculty member and to like I said, move the needle, but also being aware of the competing interests.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Before I turn to Piper, just a quick follow-up. What are some of those interests and how do they play out in terms of this question? I loved the formulation of kind of where the technical meets the public. Could you give us an example of how that plays out and sort of how you manage that?
Yeah, so one of the reports that I work on is part of what's this collective effort called the Point in Time Count of Homelessness, and it's a federal mandate by the U.S. Department of, well, it's by the Congress, but also managed by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And there are mandated questions that we have to ask people experiencing homelessness, but there is a space to ask non-mandated questions. And that's where we go into, well, there's folks who are marginalized for various reasons, and this is a chance for us to do a report on the prevalence of certain lived experiences. And we want to do this report not for HUD or you, the Congress, but for ourselves as a community. And so, what are those communities that we want to speak to? And that can engage lots of different discussions about here are the groups that are kind of silenced or hidden in previous reports, and this is the group that we want to focus on. And but there's always a cost benefit. You don't have unlimited resources, unlimited time. So if we're going to focus on this, we might have to lose a focus on that. And what I do as the researcher, I say, these are great questions. These are 10 great things. I think we could do two of them really well. So our job is to figure out which two we want to focus on this year. And I'm not passing judgment saying that these are the two most important, but what does the community feel are the two most important? And I feel that allows me to engage with some controversy, but not just end the conversation. And hear from folks who I think really don't get heard in this space.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Arturo. I have tons of questions, but I'll come back. So Piper, I would like to turn to you now. Your experience and community-facing work in some ways is different. From what I gather, you're not working with the same set of interests and pressures. These are not service-oriented kind of bureaucracies that you're working with. That have those kinds of timelines, but you are working with scientists and technologists and engineers and physicists, as well as interested Indigenous communities who may have kind of their own knowledge practices and experiences of trust and distrust working with scientists and scientific communities. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that methods in particular play in your work and how you're able to kind of maintain research grounded and kind of methodologically grounded while negotiating these interdisciplinary and engaged contexts.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Also, thank you for everybody who's joining us for the webinar. I appreciate y'all being here and the invitation to participate. This is a good and difficult question. So in some senses, everything that I'm part of doing in this project is there's sort of the interdisciplinary negotiations, there's community negotiations, and then there are some bureaucratic negotiations. This is an NSF funded project. So we're always thinking about who is the audience for what it is that we're trying to do. I think in a lot of ways, the most challenging aspect is the interdisciplinary kind of communication, and essentially the role I play across all of these different communities is that of translator. So it's about, in some ways, I think we're all sort of inherent methodologists, right? We're all observing the world, taking in information, doing something with it, and then trying to share it back out with other people. And so the trick is trying to find the right language to explain it to folks, right? So when talking with physicists, for example, they have a particular idea of terms like rigor, which we've heard a few times today, or even what methods are, or what a research question is. So there's a dance where is it a research question to try to identify where to site a very large facility and how to invite community to participate in that process, right? Is that a research question? To me, yes. To a physicist, no, because it doesn't fit the model of research and methods that fit in that discipline. So that's, there's a lot of dancing that has to happen there. And so I think of things like rigor and methods all as acts of translation, which brings me to sort of like my methodological commitments are to storytelling. So when I say translation, what I really mean is telling stories, and telling stories in a way that people can receive. And at the moment, that's mostly sort of translating between some social scientists, some science communication and science educators, sort of the strict kind of STEM folks, the NSF, which for those of you who aren't familiar, the NSF funds through directorates. So those of us in this webinar might be used to sort of the social science directorate and sort of associated ones, but the physics directorate is different. And there's also a whole other branch for sort of large facility science. The folks reviewing our grant reports and our proposals and things, they're not sociologists. There's words that make sense to us that don't make sense to them, us being sociologists. And there are situations where the words are the same, but have different meanings. So there's a lot of translation and there's a lot of storytelling that has to happen. And that's also really useful for communities. I think we sociologists sort of get locked into some of the technical details, the kind of need to almost prove our worth as scientists. And that's important, good work. And there's also a tremendous amount of power in being storytellers, whether it's telling stories that are entrusted to us by folks who don't have access to places of power, like some of the organizations and funding situations that Arturo mentioned, and places like the NSF. Ultimately, these kinds of large facilities are decided through Congress and other kind of political entities. So that adds another dimension, right, of navigating power structures and the various kinds of roles and responsibilities those folks have. And stories are accessible. Stories can be a method that makes sense to people, right? Most folks grow up hearing and telling stories in some capacity, whether it's very culturally entrenched or it's just, maybe a bedtime story that you're fortunate enough to have a grown-up read to you before you fall asleep as a kid. We have familiarity with stories, and we can introduce technical details and rigor and all of these other things that we care about as sociologists. But that may or may not matter to a particular community or translate to a particular community. So I think I might have lost track of your question, but stories are what I come back to as the root of everything.
This is it was super fascinating, and I'm struck by the tension that you mentioned between, Piper, the need to tell stories and the accessibility around stories for many of the communities that you work with, and that you're engaged with and have an interest in working with, and the tensions you might face from the physicists in the room or the funding agency that may consider storytelling as non-rigorous or not grounded. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of maybe practical strategies you use in communicating that or navigating those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes down to word choice. So the way I understand my role is that I'm constantly negotiating stories. So there's the stories that the scientists tell about the work they do and why the facility matters. There's the stories that communities tell about what's happening there or their relationship to the land. There's the story that we need to tell the NSF to keep the funding moving, in the hopes that this facility doesn't say just create new scientific knowledge, but actually is an integrated part of the community and benefits a community beyond the kind of technical ways that we think of, like an economic impact assessment or the environmental impact assessment, right? Those are the technical details that typically mediate a relationship between the scientific community and a local or indigenous community. And each of those to me is a story. They function in different ways, and I think I should probably engage with some literary scholars to have more technical details to better explain what I mean. But each one of those is a story with a purpose, right? We tell stories for a reason. We tell stories to connect. We tell stories to send a message. We tell stories to encourage people to act, behave, relate in particular kinds of ways. And so that's where the grounding, I think, comes in, is is using this understanding of stories to think about in each instance, what are we trying to accomplish, right? So for me, my role in this project is to create connections, to help build relationships, specifically between this facility and the scientists who hope to see it built, and local communities who have all kinds of different and diverse internal opinions about these sorts of things. Um, but stories are useful because they actually give me the grounding to figure out how to do this work, right? So who's the audience? What is the motivation behind the story? Um, is it a story to telling a story to multiple communities to show them where they come together, where they're more similar than different? Is it a story to encourage um, physicists to see the land in a different way, not as the geophysical characteristics, and will this, support the scientific instrument that I want to build, versus an indigenous community who sees relatives and origins and all kinds of other things in the land, right? So, am I telling a story to bring those two a little bit closer together to support a relationship? Am I trying to help a community understand the story that gravitational wave physics wants to tell? Am I trying to help gravitational wave physics understand the stories that communities want to tell? Right. And so the grounding itself exists in the mechanisms of storytelling, and how to hold those stories with care and compassion, from the perspectives of the people sharing them, and then also how to gently repackage them so that a different audience can receive it, right? Which is the same thing we do when we write a grant. It's the same thing we do when we write a report to a bureaucratic organization versus a journal article versus a book manuscript, right? Those are all different kinds of audiences. They're different kinds of storytelling to my mind, and they have the same kinds of questions. Who is the originator of the story? What is my responsibility to that story and its originator? Who is the audience? What is my responsibility to that audience? So that's sort of how I ground the work, is through the story.
Thank you so much, Piper. Arturo, I wonder if you could jump in. Piper has described so much of her work as storytelling and translation, but you also talked a little bit about that. How do you think about the communicative aspect, whether it's on the back end? So, for example, when you're trying to communicate to affected publics or the members of these advisory boards, the importance and kind of mechanics of measuring race or gender, or on the front end when you're either reporting back to grant to your funders or participating in kind of public facing scholarship, whether it's through documentary or others.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about this kind of communication and translation work in kind of your experience?
Yeah, and I really like the way that Piper mobilizes this idea of stories, that academics tell of research, as well as the stories that exist out in the broader world. Or two examples that come to mind, because I talk about stories even to this advisory board. Sometimes I ask them, what are some of the stories we hear about homelessness in Sacramento? And I feel like homelessness is highly localized in the United States. That is, we think about it in the context of our city. And if there's homelessness, it's because there's something that's going on in Sacramento. And so when I asked the advisory board about what some of the stories that we hear about homelessness that we could empirically assess through this data collection, one of the stories that we hear often is, well, we hear that a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness in Sacramento is from a different community, that they're actually coming here because we have too many good shelters, or we have too many programs, we're too generous. And this is a common myth that every community across the United States has about the people who are experiencing homelessness. They're people outside of our own community, they're outsiders. And so when we heard about this, this dominant story, we said, well, could we collect data on this point in time count? We're going to interview 600 people. Let's ask them, where did they come from? How long have they lived here in Sacramento? What was the last zip code in which they had a mailing address? If they're not from Sacramento, where they're at. And so we did this, we asked the advisory board, maybe this would be one of the focuses this year. And we did that. And the first year we did that, we found that 92% of the 600 people we interviewed had lived in Sacramento for over 5 years. And that got a lot of press and local press, this statistic. And so we did it again. And the second year we did it, we found 92%. We found that 85% of the zip codes that people shared with us were from within the county of Sacramento. And we do that every year because it dispels this myth. Another story that we hear, and it's from people experiencing homelessness, is that they experience a lot of harassment from law enforcement. And so we talked about, well, how could we measure that? And we can't say, are you being necessarily oppressed by the police, but can you tell us about the types of experiences that you have? How often do you encounter law enforcement? How often are they asking you to move or throw away your camp material? And we designed a question, we analyze it, and then we present it to the community. And the report that we produce, we do think of it as the data tells a certain story. And this was a story that also got us a lot of pushback because it turns out we found that a lot of folks have regular negative encounters with law enforcement, multiple times a month, that they lose their belongings pretty regularly. And we made that a key point of the report. And a lot of folks weren't happy in that story. One of the agreements that I always have in any project that I do is to have editorial control of the report writing. And while we will share that with the advisory board a little bit ahead of time and get kind of back and forth about how we're framing certain things, at the end of the day, I do take ownership of what we write. And the tension that I receive sometimes is that my stories are limited by what the data can tell. And I emphasize that a lot. Now, some advocates will take some of the data points and kind of extrapolate further, and they have every right to do that. And some other groups will take the data point and advocate a slightly different position. And I don't know if Piper feels this, but the tension I get is, quote unquote, being labeled an advocate. I definitely am choosing the questions we're asking, and people know this is my orientation. I'm in School of Social Work. I'm a sociologist. We're going to talk about disparities. We're going to talk about these issues. But I am a social scientist, and so I'm limited by what my data says. And I definitely got branded, quote unquote, as an advocate in this last report that we did, where we highlighted the law enforcement piece. And I've been thinking about that. Am I an advocate or am I a researcher? Can you do both? And I don't have an answer to that, but it's definitely something that I think about quite a bit. My next question, I'll talk about the documentary that I've been working on, because that's been kind of a pivot for me, where I've kind of gone from the kind of purely quantitative estimates of homelessness to now telling a full-on story about a particular encampment here in Sacramento called Camp Resolution, and the story that officially exists about this camp and what the documentary brings up. But I don't want to dominate the conversation here. I'm going to a different thing, but I'd be curious what Piper thinks about this distinction between advocates / social scientists, or maybe I'm the only one who feels this one.
Thank you so much, Arturo. So yeah, Piper, could you reflect on that bit? And I'll just add, in negotiating that criticism or that label, or whether you embrace it or not, when and how do you hold on to your kind of training as a social scientist, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks for the question, both of you. And I also am super curious about the documentary. This sort of visual storytelling is something I'm edging closer and closer to. So particularly the shift from quantitative research to documentary seems like a big leap on the surface, but I think perhaps it's not actually. So hopefully we'll have time for you to tell us a little bit more. I think being a predominantly qualitative scholar, I come at this a little differently. I so there's my training and then there's what I actually do. And I have never really bought into sociological research as being something that is ever kind of neutral, unbiased, objective. Um, that's not a commitment I have. I do have a very strong commitment to the stories. And so I think I fully embrace being an advocate. I am always an advocate for the way of doing, seeing, hearing, perceiving, experiencing, embodying the world when it is not the way that one is quote unquote supposed to. Um, and that doesn't mean it's without tension. I can think of numerous examples, in particular with this project, where um, I am seen as an advocate, and there's concern about my ability to do the work of translation. Um, uh, because I think due to life experiences, worldview, um, my discomfort with sort of empirical enlightenment scientific projects, um, that I very much am seen as an advocate and maybe not a great spokesperson for the project itself, um, which is, I think, largely due to me learning to translate into and from that perspective, because it's not something that I have embraced. All of this is to say that given the dominance of that kind of like enlightenment, positivist, scientific worldview, right? That's what rigor is. That's what objectivity is. Uh, there is a strong sense amongst funders, amongst um, political leaders, among scientists themselves, that what they're doing is somehow for the greater good. It's knowledge that will benefit everyone somehow. And that's not an obvious case to be made for sociology. And so questioning that really dominant kind of perspective and saying, well, why? How is it actually going to help somebody when the real concerns in the community are a lot of folks are homeless, or a lot of folks don't have healthcare, or folks don't have running water? Um, Trying to sort of like cut through some of those things puts me more squarely in advocate role, when what I'm trying to do is translate. And so for me, the tension is more between role as translator and role as advocate, because there's a way that trust can be lost when we're perceived as advocates. And it can go in multiple directions, right? So it is entirely possible for an Indigenous community, for example, to see me as an advocate for the scientific project when my personal values, my personal experiences may be more aligned with the community than with the project in certain respects. And there's a dance, and I'm better at the dance with communities than I am at the dance with scientists because that's my training, right? As a qualitative researcher, my training is to build trust, to uh, bring my whole self to the work in a way that allows me to be legible, to be a real person and not the brain, right? Not this person coming in to document me, to observe me, but just a person who cares, who wants to have a conversation, and who wants to use their relative privilege within these halls of power to bring stories to light. Um, so that's where I see the tension. And interestingly, it's in some ways harder to activate my training to um, be trusted within the scientific community than it is outside of it. And that's been an interesting kind of surprise in the work, because the training is all about being accessible to the people we're asking to share stories, right? Because there's no reason that people should trust us. There's no reason that people should want to share our stories There are long histories of misrepresentation and these kinds of things by folks in our discipline. So it's a lot to overcome. Um, but we don't get trained in how to overcome things interdisciplinarily, in large part, other than to maybe not try to use the kind of quantified Enlightenment science language to talk about qualitative research. That's about the extent of it. So uh, I embrace being an advocate, but it's harder to um, demonstrate credibility as a translator.
Thank you so much, Piper. Arturo, I do want to hear about the documentary, but I'm going to challenge you to work it in while you're answering my next question, because
Nice.
one of the kind of one of our main concerns here at First Publics has to do with kind of how we teach, who we teach, and to what end, and thinking about teaching itself as a form of public engagement. And now Piper has challenged us to think a little bit more about training, what kind of training we're getting, are we mobilizing that training, et cetera, right, in doing this work. So, Arturo, in I wonder if you could help us think about, what do you think is important to communicate to students about this work, right? Whether it's about the importance of methods, or how
Mm.
you think, maybe how this work has it re-informed your teaching, or what you think is important to communicate to students in particular about the way they go about engaging in research, or in particular, kind of this engaged research that whether it's, that ultimately has a politics to it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think, my answer is partly, the context that I'm in the School of Social Work. So we're training social workers.
Mm.
And as the embedded sociologist, I'm trying to get them to think about their work as, working in the community, engaging with meso macro issues, not necessarily micro issues. And I teach a second year, at the end of their master's in social work, at this kind of year-long research sequence on community-based research. And this is where I bring in a lot of this, the research I do on homelessness. And we talk about this tension about being seen as an advocate or not. And for some of the social work students, like, they are going to be working in community-based organizations where they're going to be advocating for their clients and their communities, and the advocacy identity is very important. Some of them are going to be embedded within state institutions where they're going to be working on behalf of the state, and they're going to be seen as policy analysts, and there they have to walk that advocacy more implicitly, or just be aware of how they're presenting it. And I do think it is just, advocates are seen as outside of the power, and they're advocating at a certain point. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you just have to realize when you mobilize that. Research for me is in the middle, is that yes, you can mobilize research for advocacy or a policy, but to me it's understanding the limits of what you can and cannot say with research. And to me, I use this kind of framework of information literacy. What is the information out there? What does the evidence actually say about homelessness or poverty or inequality in California? And a lot of my projects, I have my students go out and interview stakeholders and in the community and get their viewpoints on homelessness or whatever policy. And I'm going to work in my documentary here, because one of the projects that we did is, there was an encampment here in Sacramento where a group of women basically squatted up a parking lot. And the parking lot had been designated to become a tiny home community. And then the city decided it was going to cost too much money, and they gave up the plans on it. And a group of about 50 women came and squatted the parking lot and refused to leave and said, "You're going to have to arrest us." And the city became so embarrassed that they signed a lease with the women to hold the parking lot. And so when I was find out about this, I was like, "This is an amazing thing. Let's go study it." And so we connected with the women, and we decided to hold class at the camp. And we would do these field trips there, and the students would interview the women and people around the community about what was this project. And it was really important for me for the students to get that kind of on the ground experience. And as social workers, they're good at having conversations. So we leaned in as a kind of a qualitative ethnography slash open-ended interviews, and all the students wrote their thesis basically about, the experiences that these women were going through. And during this process, there was a film crew that was kind of buzzing around the camp, and but they didn't have access to the camp because they didn't have the relationships with the camp. And so when they reached me and said, "Hey, we kind of want to include this camp," but I kind of took a little bit of ownership. I said, "Well, if you're going to work with me and my students, I want to I want to be a co-producer of this." And we got to do this carefully, and we're gonna have an agreement with the women. We're gonna have an agreement with what we're doing, and my students were part of that. So the filmmaking kind of ended up being a film about my class in this camp, but also about the story of this camp as it existed. And that's where my role in the community maybe slided more as an advocate. And I knew that I was kind of giving up certain advantages of the egghead identity, but I was okay with that because I feel like the conversation about homelessness in the West Coast, but also in our country more generally, has switched to something very negative and very punitive. And I am concerned about this massive criminalization of people experiencing homelessness that we're seeing. So I thought this would be a great counter narrative of, okay, why are these women taking over this parking lot? And what is the city going to do? And so we documented over a year and a half kind of what was going on in this parking lot. We finished the film and we started doing some campus tours. We're going to UCLA next week to do a screening, and we've been screening across California about this story. The film is called The Right to Exist, and we're a distributor we just heard last week wants to represent us, so we're hopefully going to be selling it to libraries, and there's my little pitch. And I have no idea what I'm doing here. I am not a movie maker, but it's just been going along with this pathway that presented itself. And so that's the nice thing about being an academic, a sociologist. Opportunities sometimes open themselves up, and I said, why not? Let's try to do this. And so that's what my life's been like the last year and a half, is pretending to be a documentary filmmaker.
Thank you so much, Arturo. And thanks. In part, you're modeling kind of learning alongside, right? Your students on the ground, in concert with and in consideration, both kind of ethically and politically, with the communities that you work with, right? And I think that's super interesting and instructive for us. Piper, could you briefly talk a little bit about your teaching? We do have some questions in the audience, and so I want to give some space to that. But I'd love to hear about how you think about teaching and what are your priorities in the classroom or when you're working with advising or teaching students.
Yeah, sure. So I think I have the great fortune to teach a graduate methods course in gendered women's studies, which is mostly PhD students from our program, but then the University of Arizona has a process by which you can minor as a PhD candidate. So we have a lot of PhD students from all kinds of disciplines who minor in GWS, and one of the requirements of both the major and the minor is to take feminist research methods, which is sort of an interesting, already that course is kind of loaded, right? It's already interdisciplinary. What methods might one choose to teach? How do I, as a sociologist, teach somebody whose PhD is in Russian literature, for example, what methods look like? I said before, I should talk with more literary scholars. So it creates this interesting challenge. And many of us go to graduate school because we're really curious about something, right? We have our particular interest. We want to go really, really deep. And it can be difficult to come up for air. And so one of the things when I teach is always to use the two, what I call most obnoxious but most important questions I learned in a sociology PhD program, which are, so what? And what is this a case of? Which are really, really hard for students to cope with, I'll say. And I asking them because it feels kind of mean when somebody's telling you about their interest in their research question and you say, okay, so what, right? That doesn't feel very good. But it's in the service of making those connections that the things we're interested for a reason. And they connect to these macro meso level structural things, power things, right? All of this stuff. And it can be really hard to think beyond, okay, this is the only answer to so what is, well, how can I influence policy, right? But when we're thinking about public engagement and we're thinking about the audiences for our work, suddenly so what expands, right? It becomes much more than policy. It becomes much more than, is some other sociologist going to be interested in this, right? Particularly because a lot of what I do tends to be in areas that Kristen Schilt calls the not sociology problem, right? You talk about your work and people say, well, that's neat, but it's not sociology, right? And one of the most important things I think I do when teaching methods to students is helping them see that their work matters beyond the academy and beyond their personal interest, that every question we can ask, everything we're curious about is actually connected to these sort of more and more macro level kinds of need to understand how the world is working, what's our place in it, and how might our work be picked up by someone? Where can we creatively bring that work? We have no control over what happens once we put something out into the world, but we do have control over what we communicate and where we communicate it. And some of the most wonderful conversations, particularly recently, have been with grad students talking about their dissertations and them saying, I've been bogged down with everything happening in the world and I can't quite figure out how to have the motivation to do this work. And then the conversation unfolds from there to say, well, your work connects to all of these other things that everyone is experiencing right now. We are all living in an increasingly digital world. So what does it mean to have an authentic identity in a digital space, right? The small, very specific research question that someone's asking is connected to questions that every single person on the planet is laboring under to some extent, right? And when students start to think about the so what's and the what is this a case of, that to me is where methods become public. That's the link. That's the connection, is that I'm doing this because I'm personally interested. And it's not easy for social scientists to say that our work is going to naturally and of course benefit everyone. But it does naturally and of course benefit everyone because we're all human beings in social interactions existing under these kinds of structures and what have you. And so we always have something to contribute. And watching students go from there's no point in me doing my dissertation to, oh wow, this is connected to like all of this other stuff and it's so important. Or even it's not important, but somebody else might care. Yeah. Someone might pick up this research and understand themselves or their world a little bit better. That's a powerful thing. And to me, that's what public engagement is about with sociology is can we and how can we help people understand the world better, create some possibility to break out of sort of our doldrums and imagine something better and then believe that we can make it happen. That's why I get excited about teaching methods.
Thank you so much, Piper. We do have some questions in the chat, and folks in the room with us, please you can type your questions in the chat. I think there's a mechanism for like raising your hand, but I'll start by reading what's in the chat to both of you. Neither of them is directed to one or the other, and I'll let you choose. So the first one has to do with kind of folks, graduate students thinking about the job market. So I'd like your opinion on how to navigate the job market and academic institutions as a predominantly qualitative researcher. How do you recommend we demonstrate that qualitative research methods are as reliable as other quantitative research methods, and maybe particularly in this political environment? So that's one important question for graduate students. A second question is, in interdisciplinary and community engaged projects, how do you navigate the challenges of practicing sociological methods in ways that foster trust and accountability, particularly given the risk that research may be perceived and experienced as extractive rather than grounded in reciprocal relationships? Both really good kind of practical questions. Arturo, you want to get us started?
Yeah, I mean, I have an answer to both of them in a sense. I think the qualitative one is interesting. I mean, I my dissertation was actually purely qualitative, and then I became much more quantitative in my kind of policy experiences, and I identify as a mixed method researcher really at this point. I think, qualitative methods are like incredibly important in various contexts, and I'll just answer in kind of non-academic context because it is pretty widely accepted, at least here in California, as a legitimate form of inquiry that is particularly good at certain things like describing the context, talking about lived experience, describing a process. And so I think you should lean into that. And you don't need to even be defensive about it. I do think folks do recognize that. I also think being a mixed method researcher is incredibly important because it allows you to do that kind of translation work with how does my qualitative research complement, add to, if not problematize, quantitative research. And it doesn't have to be high level, hierarchical regression models. It's just having a basic familiarity with descriptive statistics is usually good enough in the policy arena. And I do encounter some folks sometimes who feel a little bit like they need to prove something as a qualitative researcher, which I feel like they don't. I think they're trained as a qualitative researcher, and that's their strength. I also love the second question about the extractive. I heard that word. I mean, I do think forming trust is incredibly important, and something I tell all of my students and remind myself is don't promise anything you can't deliver, and deliver everything that you promise. And so that means sometimes just being realistic with yourself and saying, what can I actually produce? And I've made a mistake of over promising, and now I've do the opposite of overproducing what I promised, and always hitting my deadlines. And so I think that's really important, and having a candid conversation about what you can actually accomplish or not in a semester or year-long process. I also tell all of my community partners that, like, at the end of the day, when I do the interpretation analysis, I'm doing an independent analysis, and I will obviously go to them first. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, and I welcome their feedback. But I do kind of gravitate towards I'm going to have this independence into what I'm doing. But just because I feel like it's not going to be the process, the research necessarily that they want to do, but it's a collaboration between myself and them. But that's how I've navigated. And my policy folks are like, these are people representing state entities. And I do have to kind of explicitly say, I don't work for you. We're working together on said project. Great
Very helpful.
questions.
Yeah, very helpful, Arturo. Piper. So there's a
Yeah.
job market qualitative question and the question of accountability
Mhm.
given histories of extractive research.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to kind of labor under the belief that there is a dichotomy and a hierarchy between quantitative and qualitative methods. And the first step is to let go of that set of assumptions. They're different. In a lot of ways, quantitative methods aren't reliable in some kind of like capital T true sense, right? Anybody who reads the news can see the way that statistics get manipulated. all of these methods are more about what we do with them and how we talk about them than anything sort of inherent to the method itself. So I don't, and this is my own kind of I don't know if it's a curmudgeonly bias or something, but I don't immediately assume that quantitative is better or that technical is better or that numerical is um, better. There are a lot of cases where, in fact, that's the opposite of true. And particularly in the work I'm doing now, historians of science make that case for me. That in fact, sometimes the qualitative methods are more reliable than the quantitative methods. But all of these come down to the how and the why of using them. And so I think the best way I think about this is that we are creating something when we do research. We aren't just reflecting something that exists as truth, right? We are in a process of creation, and if I think about this as say building a house or something, um, we need different tools depending on what it is we're trying to build in the house. You don't want to use a screwdriver to do the job of a hammer, and vice versa. And so it's not about comparison between quantitative and qualitative. It's about being able to confidently tell the story of your work and why it matters and why the tools you've chosen match the questions you care about and help you share the information that matters. And I think, on the job market, jobs will tell you if they want a qualitative person or a quantitative person, or they don't really care, but they sure do hope you can teach stats. Um, and so when I think about the job market, it's about telling, again, stories, right? What is the story of who you are that you want to tell to a job? Um, and how do you demonstrate that the story of you matches the story of that department within the institution it's in? Um, and so that's what matters to me, not trying to prove that my methods are sound or my research question is sound. I think the work I do is awesome. Um, and and that's an important story to tell because if you think your work is awesome, other people will think it's awesome. As to the second question, it's the extraction
Trust.
versus yeah, all of that's really true, and I think time is a really big factor in this. Um, the timelines of our funding and such often determine how much time and availability we have to actually be in reciprocal relationship. So my 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 advice there is to show up um, and to move at the pace of trust, which is often slower than the pace of questions and answers. So it means making an introduction and then being patient. It means if you have introduced yourself to a community and they offer for you to come in and participate in something, you show up. If you are doing interviews and that interview happens to be at someone's home, bring a gift. Not something, we often talk about things like we're going to compensate people for their time with a gift card or something. That is relatively meaningless, and you can't quantify someone's time, someone's story, someone's experience. Um, but you can demonstrate gratitude and appreciation by bringing something small, something that is meaningful to who you are, where you're from, or that shows some kind of sense of how you understand the questions you're asking this person and their meaning. It means doing the dishes after someone offers you a cup of coffee in their house when you're doing an interview, right? It just means showing up and being a person. And that's the way to get outside of the extractive relationship that research can often have, right? Research in that sense is I'm coming in, I have something I need from you, and then I'm going to leave and go use it for the thing I need. But meeting someone where they're at as a person and going slow, giving time for pause, giving time for patience. That's to me, that's the beginning. Is acting like a person, not a researcher.
Thank you so much, Piper. We are actually out of time, and I want to be mindful of our kind of promise that this would be an hour long. And I want to thank you, Piper Sledge and Arturo Baiocchi, for participating in this conversation. This was super illuminating, and I feel really honored to have had you on the panel. And thank you all of our attendees. We will follow up with a write-up, and there's more opportunities for engaging on this topic. If anybody in the audience wants to reach out to collaborate on First Publics, or participate in future conversations, we'd be happy to hear from you. And thank you all again.